The fluorescent lights buzzed above me, casting a cold, sterile glow over the hospital room. It was a quiet night shift, the kind where time crawls. I was a nursing student, eager to gain experience, and tonight I was assigned to the psychiatric ward. My heart raced with anticipation as I entered the ward. The door creaked ominously behind me, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The air was thick with a mixture of antiseptic and something unidentifiable, a smell that lingered in the corners of the rooms. I'd heard the stories, patients whose minds had fractured into madness, shadows of who they once were. I approached room 213, where they said a particularly troubled patient, Mark, had been placed. He had a history of violent outbursts, and whispers floated around the nurse's station about how he once injured a staff member. As I stood outside his door, I felt a pang of fear, but curiosity urged me forward. I peeked through the small window. Mark sat on the edge of his bed, his back hunched, eyes wide-eyed and blinking. The way he stared into the distance was unsettling. I took a deep breath and knocked softly. "Mark, it's time for your medication." He turned slowly, and I was struck by the intensity of his gaze. His eyes were a wild mix of desperation and fury, and for a moment I felt as if he could see right through me. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice hoarse yet clear. "Why not?" I managed to ask, though my heart raced. "I'm just here to help." A chilling smile spread across his face, twisting his features. "Help? You think you can help me?" He stood abruptly, pacing the small room with an unsettling grace, like a predator toying with its prey. "You don't even know what's in my head." I instinctively took a step back, my hand brushing against the cold metal of the doorframe. "Mark, let's just talk. I'm here to listen." He stopped and turned sharply, eyes narrowing. "Listen? You think anyone ever listens? They just want to medicate me, lock me away like a monster, but they don't understand. I see things." "What do you see?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though panic clawed at my insides. He leaned closer, breath hot and rancid. "The shadows," he breathed, as if sharing a secret. "They come for me at night. They whisper in my ears, and I can't make them stop." He paused, his expression shifting to one of intense rage. "But I can make them stop. I can make them all stop." Fear surged through me as I realized he was not just talking about his demons. He meant the staff, the patients. His fists clenched, and I could see the tension coiling in his muscles, ready to spring. "Mark, let's take a deep breath," I tried, reaching for the medication on the cart nearby. But in that moment, he lunged at me, and I barely had time to react. I stumbled back, knocking into the cart, sending syringes clattering to the floor. In an instant, Mark was upon me, his hands gripping my arms with a strength I hadn't expected. "You don't belong here," he shouted, eyes blazing with a mix of terror and fury. Panic exploded in my chest. I cried out for help, but the ward felt eerily empty. The other patients were locked away, oblivious to the chaos unfolding in room 113. I could feel his breath on my neck, cold and wild, and for a moment I thought I might not make it out. But just as quickly as it began, the moment shifted. A loud noise echoed down the hall, another nurse rushing to assist. Mark froze, his grip slackening as he turned towards the sound, momentarily distracted. I seized the opportunity, tearing myself free and stumbling backward until I collided with the wall. The nurse burst into the room, eyes wide with shock. "What's happening?" she demanded. Mark stepped back, hands raised in a gesture of surrender, but I could see the madness still swirling in his gaze. "Nothing," he said, his voice smooth, almost calm, "just a little misunderstanding." As the nurse approached, I caught my breath, my heart still racing, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. I could see the shadows flickering behind his eyes, the truth of his madness lurking just beneath the surface. They restrained him again, the struggle brief but intense. As they led him away, I felt a chill settle over me. The ward returned to its eerie silence, but I knew that the real horror was still there, waiting in the shadows, hidden behind the facade of sanity. I left the room, knowing I would never forget the look in his eyes or the chilling truth that anyone can become a monster in the right circumstances. I never thought I'd end up in a hospital, especially not like this. I wasn't supposed to be here. It was just a routine checkup, an appointment for a bad back I'd been putting off for months. But one thing led to another, and suddenly I was in the hospital bed after a routine scan turned up to be something much worse than I could have imagined. It wasn't long before they admitted me to a room. The pain was awful, like someone had driven a spike through my spine. I remember my fingers gripping the edge of the bed as they adjusted the floor, and the nurse telling me I'd be fine after a few days of observation. It felt like it was going to be an uneventful stay, a short-term problem to be fixed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong from the moment I was wheeled into that ward. The lights above flickered intermittently, and the air smelled stale, almost sterile. The hallway outside my room was unnervingly quiet, not a soul in sight. The nurse, a thin woman with graying hair, left quickly after setting up my medications. "I'll be back to check on you," she said, but there was something about her eyes, something off, like she didn't really care whether I was alive or dead. I tried to rest, but the pain in my back wouldn't let me sleep. The beeping of the machines was constant, but somehow hollow, like it didn't belong in the space. I kept hearing muffled voices in the hallway outside, too faint to understand, but enough to make me feel isolated. After a while, I decided to get up. The room felt like a tomb. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, wincing as a jolt of pain shot through my body. But it was bearable. I grabbed the first stand for support and slowly made my way to the door. I needed air. I needed to know I wasn't alone. When I stepped into the hallway, it was eerily quiet. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I turned toward the sound, but the hallway was empty. The lights buzzed overhead, flickering again. A chill crept up my spine. I looked down toward the nurse's station, but the desk was abandoned. I considered calling out, but something stopped me. Something in the back of my mind whispered that it wasn't right. I turned the other way, walking cautiously, my bare feet slapping against the cold floor. My room was at the end of the hall, so I didn't have far to go. But then I saw something that froze me in place. There was a man standing at the far end of the corridor, near the elevators. He was dressed in scrubs, but his posture was all wrong. He was hunched, almost too stiff. I couldn't see his face at first, only the outline of his silhouette in the dim light. I thought he was another patient or maybe a staff member, but something about the way he stood there, it didn't feel right. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice shaking more than I intended. He didn't respond, not at first. I took a cautious step forward, then another, but he still didn't move. The silence in the hall was suffocating now. I glanced back over my shoulder, still no one else in sight. I took another step, and then, finally, the man turned his head slowly, as though the motion itself was painful for him. And when I saw his face, I felt my stomach drop. It was pale, too pale, with sallow skin stretched tight over the bones. His eyes were bloodshot and sunken, the pupils wide and unblinking. A slight, unsettling smile tugged at the corners of his lips, but there was something hollow about it, something predatory. "Can I help you?" I asked, though I knew the answer already. The man didn't speak. Instead, he started walking toward me, slow, deliberate, like he was savoring every step. I backed up instinctively, the cold edge of fear curling at the pit of my stomach. He didn't move quickly, but it didn't matter. There was a certainty in his movements that made my skin crawl. The hallway stretched longer, as if it were getting farther and farther away from me, pulling me into a place where I couldn't escape. The man's smile grew wider as he drew closer. "Hey," I called out, finally gathering the nerve to raise my voice. "Help, somebody, help." But my voice felt small, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the hallway. The man's footfalls grew louder, but still no one came. Suddenly, he stopped, just a few feet away from me. He tilted his head, almost as if studying me. I could see a strange glint in his eyes, a predatory gleam, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that he wasn't here to help me. I turned and ran. My heart pounded in my chest, my legs aching with every step, but I could hear him behind me, keeping pace, never rushing, as if he was toying with me. The beeping of the machines in my room grew louder in my mind as I ran, my hand gripping the pole like a weapon. I made it back to my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I backed away, my chest heaving, trying to steady my breath. I looked through the small window in the door, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. But he was gone. The hallway was empty again. I didn't stay in that hospital much longer after that. I don't care what they say about my diagnosis or the fact that I needed treatment. Something was wrong with that place. The staff, the atmosphere. It wasn't just the drugs or the pain that was messing with my head. I know what I saw, and I know who I saw. There was a killer on that ward. And when I finally checked out, I overheard something from a nurse at the desk, something that chilled me to my core. "He won't hurt you," she said to a new patient, one who had just arrived. "Just don't try to leave your room at night. He's very persistent." I didn't stick around to hear more. I got out of there as fast as I could. To this day, I don't know if he was a patient, a staff member, or something else entirely. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't the only one who saw him. I'll never forget the old woman in the room next to mine. It was my first night at the hospital after a routine surgery, nothing too serious. But even in my groggy, post-op state, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started when I noticed her. I was lying in my bed, trying to drift off, when I heard the soft shuffle of slippers on the floor, the faintest creak of a door, The noise seemed to come from the room next door, but I hadn't seen anyone go in there. In fact, the room had been empty all day, as far as I knew. Then, just before I managed to drift off to sleep, I heard it. A low, raspy voice so faint I almost thought I imagined it. "Help me, please." I didn't think much of it at first. Hospitals are full of strange sounds and noises. People talk in their sleep, but as the night wore on, it became more frequent. That voice growing weaker, pleading, echoing through the walls. I had to wonder if it was some poor soul in the room next door struggling with pain, or maybe even delirium. Still, I tried to sleep. The next day, when the nurse came in to check on me, I asked about the woman in the room next door. She looked at me like I was crazy, and then a look of confusion crossed her face. "What old lady?" she asked, brushing it off as if I were imagining things. "There's no one in that room. It's been empty since last week." I tried to explain what I had heard, but she just smiled sympathetically, the kind of smile you give a patient who's been under anesthesia and is still coming to their senses. That night, though, the voice returned. This time it was louder, almost frantic. "Please, help me." I could feel my pulse quicken. I knew I had to do something. So, half-dazed and heavily medicated, I got out of bed and shuffled over to the door of the old woman's room. It was cracked open, the light from the hallway casting long shadows inside. I hesitated, but then pushed it open, expecting to find a frail, confused woman, maybe a new patient who had slipped out of bed or a nurse who needed help. What I saw, though, nearly stopped my heart. The room was dark, unnaturally dark, the kind of dark that doesn't come from the absence of light, but from something else, something that swallowed all the light around it. At first I thought I was just seeing things, but then I saw her. She was sitting in the corner of the room, her back bent at an unnatural angle, her body twisted in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Her eyes glowed faintly, like the reflection of light off glass. She stared at me with a look so empty, so hollow, that for a second I thought I might collapse from sheer terror. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could hear her whispering, faintly, that same plea. "Help me, please." My heart was racing, my head spun. I backed away slowly, my hand gripping the doorframe, my legs turning to jelly beneath me. But just as I was about to turn and run, the whisper came again. "Help me, before it's too late." I turned and fled, slamming the door behind me. The nurse found me in the hallway a few minutes later, panicked and almost hyperventilating. She called for a doctor, but when they came to check the old woman's room, they found nothing. The room was empty. The bed was made. There was no sign of anyone or anything out of place. I was never the same after that night. I don't know if I was dreaming or if I was losing my mind. I don't know if there was ever anyone in that room. But I do know this, the old woman's voice, the whispering. I still hear it sometimes, even now, in the quiet of the night.